So do keep as you join anyone new who's just joined and might have missed the earlier request to enter where you're joining from. Please do go ahead into the chat and enter where you're from. And in fact, I'd love you to keep using the chat as we go through the session to make it as interactive as possible and bring it to life. And as you know, we are going to be talking about the world of inclusion and diversity, and it's absolutely awesome to see such a diverse group already as we explore culture and cultural intelligence and really what identifies our cultural makeup. So what we're going to be focusing on is learning how to recognize and interpret cultural behaviors, your own and others, and really increasing your self-awareness, as well as looking at some simple cultural strategies. So it's absolutely great to have you, and let's jump in and get going as we are now well on our way. So let's start by a very first question I have for you on this journey of the road to cultural discovery. And that is, what are some of the challenges you face when working across different cultures? I would imagine that most of you work across different cultures. It's possibly what's brought you here. And I'd love to hear from you what you are finding most challenging. And we're actually going to do that through using a tool called Mural. So Luke has kindly dropped into the chat a link to Mural. And I'd love you to click on that link. And you might be asked to create a profile. You don't actually have to do that. You can just bypass that and enter as a visitor. And let's head over now and have a look at what's happening in Mural. So if you've not yet used Mural before, all you do is you double click. You'll see a whole range of sticky notes. You double click on a sticky note, you type in your entry, and then you click off it and the entry saves. And on the side of your screen, you will also see a little toolbar. And you can use that as well, but really just double click on that, and let's have a look and see what some of your challenges are. And it's really interesting always to see the different challenges, and in that way we can shape what we talk about as we go through this session and expand on certain points. So I see many of you typing away and entering. I'll just give you a few moments. So we've got interpreting a behavior. That's a really great one, because sometimes we'll see a behavior and we'll just wonder what it means or what might be motivating a particular behavior. We know that there are different views of hierarchy and decision-making, and there's always that fear of miscommunication. Might we offend somebody without even realizing? That can be really tricky. How to handle silence. Silence can be awkward in conversations anyway, but when we're layering in some of the complexities of different cultures, that can be even more challenging. Talking about family and hobbies, time zones. Also, another really interesting point is what is perceived as funny, or which jokes will land and which will not. And there's always concern and risk around that one's humor might be interpreted differently, very differently across different cultures. There are so many cultural variations, and we assume sameness. And that's one of the things we'll really be focusing on today, is making sure that we don't make assumptions and that we build our awareness, both of ourselves as well as of others. Words mean different things, very different things in different cultures. Understanding the meaning, it can be really tricky overcoming language barriers when working with different cultures. And then we've got different holidays and accommodating those. How to associate meaning to facial expressions and voice tones, that can be really different and really differently interpreted. Being too direct, absolutely a really important one. Gestures, the different characters of different cultures, different working hours, humor, we mentioned, and idioms and analogies. Very, very different. How to meet behavioral expectations. So over enthusiasm, when it's not in your nature, that can be really difficult. If your cultural norm is much quieter, that can be really difficult. And I see, Oslam, you've raised a hand. I don't know if you have a question, if you're having any challenges with accessing, do let us know in the chat as well. Negative connotation to culture. Absolutely. And that can happen in a number of different ways. We might be biased against a particular culture or towards a particular culture. We might be conscious of others being biased towards our particular culture. I know I definitely experienced that growing up in South Africa in the 70s and 80s at the height of the apartheid era. I know that when I traveled, people were not very pleased to hear that I was from South Africa, and I found that really challenging. Understandable, but very, very challenging. Different behaviors around the fear of failure. Really good one. How to distinguish between a culture, behavior, and a personality trait. Another really, really interesting one. So we've got some truly fascinating entries here. And I can see that there's a lot of energy around this topic with all these different comments coming in. Navigating cultural sensitivity with multicultural clients. Yeah. Expats. Having to communicate virtually. That's a really interesting one. Differences are solved with a phone call, and we're often, most of the time, not face to face in the same room as someone, which of course makes it even more challenging. How do we navigate these differences? So some absolutely brilliant ones. Thank you so much for entering those. Let's continue on, because I think we could spend another hour here doing our inputs, which is just fascinating. So thank you for that and really setting the scene. So let's consider for a moment is that one of the really important topics that we're going to be covering today is increasing our self-awareness. Is the more aware we are, the more successfully we can navigate these many challenges that we have begun to highlight. So question for you, why do you think self-awareness is so important? Why do you think self-awareness is so important? And Melba, I see also you have a raised hand. I'm wondering if you have a question. Do enter that question into the chat. Why is self-awareness in the world of cross-cultural communication so important? And just activate the chat and enter your answers there. Yeah, fantastic. If we are self-aware, we're able to adapt our own behavior to different cultures and personalities. If we don't own it, we can't change it. I love that. That is so important. It's about really taking ownership and accountability for our impact in order to know our own biases, because these biases are going to get in the way of our being able to truly connect and communicate effectively with those who are very different from us. You can't interact with other cultures until you know who you are. Absolutely. We need to be aware of our own strengths and weaknesses to be able to properly understand different ones. Increasing understanding. Easier to proceed mindfully. I love that. To be mindful is such a great attitude to take into cross-cultural communication and collaboration. when we're self-aware, we can really appreciate difference and celebrate difference. And we can have more control over our own responses and behaviors and take responsibility and ownership. Yeah, having to give a lot of context. Often we fail to give context on simple comments that might be misperceived. To face different mirrors and deeply discover ourselves. Yeah, and a really great point. Without self-awareness, there's a risk that we may not come across how we wish we were coming across. We may not be aware of our impact and unintentionally offending others or dominating others without even realizing. So clearly this is an area that is so important, and hopefully everything we do in this session is going to be about increasing our self-awareness, because individual self-awareness follows organizational self-awareness and social awareness. Absolutely. So let's start by exploring what we actually mean by culture. So again, in the chat, I have a question for you. What do you think makes a culture? In other words, what are the elements of culture? When we think about culture, what comes to mind? How does culture get communicated and transmitted? And what makes up culture? So we're really familiar with the word culture, but each of us might have a slightly different interpretation of what we mean by culture. Commonly accepted social behavior in a particular context, differences, traditions, values and beliefs, people, a way of communication has huge implications when it comes to communication. The habits of a group, and that could be a country and a family or a school, the way things are done around here and what's accepted, what's considered the norm, what you do and how you do it. Love that. History absolutely has a massive impact. Our perceptions, our view of the world is all shaped by our particular cultural makeup. Body language, yeah, it's not just what we say, it's what we believe or what we think. It's also what we do, our everyday interactions, our beliefs, our learned behaviors, also where we come from geographically, and that spills into art and music and language, all of those different things. Absolutely. So one of the reasons navigating and understanding culture is so challenging at times is when we think about the analogy of a hippo, which personally is a real favorite, given that the hippo comes from Africa, where I'm from, is that there's only a very tiny percentage of culture that we are able to see, that's visible to us above the surface. And when you think about hippos, one of the reasons they're one of the biggest killers of human beings is that when they are in their natural habitat, most of the hippo is under the water, that actually the tiniest bit of the hippo can be seen above the surface. And so if we think about this, there's what we see on the surface, and that will be things like behaviors that you've mentioned, and language and family structure. Those can differ across different cultures, politics, our clothes, the music, food, games, so on, all those different things. Those are the visible ones. And yes, Jill, I love that it's not the iceberg, which you usually see. So what we see on the surface, but what we often are taken by surprise with is what is actually happening that we don't see, what's under the surface. And those are the intangible things often that are the thoughts, the feelings, the value systems, spirituality, and how that particular culture views that, and religion and biases and assumptions and beliefs, all of those different things. And there are even more than this. These are the aspects that often surprise us, take us by surprise, especially if we encounter them in a setting where we're not expecting them. Because culture is not just a set of visible behaviors, it's deeply, deeply rooted in each of us. And the superficial aspects of our social behavior, our manners, our language, and all of those things are actually the vehicle that gets the need that sits below the surface met. So those values driving our behaviors, our mindset, our driving our decisions, and so on. And so below the surface sits these hidden values and the assumptions that they express. So understanding cultures involves much more than understanding immediately visible behavior. And the invisible parts of culture, like values and beliefs and ways of thinking, are actually the most important because they drive everything that we see. And actually, Christian, that is a really interesting point. In other words, is culture the external manifestation? So that will be both the external manifestation, but also your culture is going to inform what you define as moral or immoral, for example, how you make those judgments. So actually, it's something that's happening both above and below the surface. We'll see that manifesting above, but where that's the root of that, the anchor of that sits below. So such an interesting comment there. And, you know, a great example of this is Western dress may be the norm. Just last week, my husband was at a conference and he met a delegate, a female delegate from Saudi Arabia. And his first thought was to put out his hand, to shake her hand. And immediately she pulled back and let him know that in her culture, it's not appropriate for a man to shake a woman's hand. And it just, something that he just remarked on was that it really took him by surprise, because here he was in this Western environment, and it was his last thought on his mind that this would be something that might not be the norm or acceptable. What emerged was a really great conversation, and I'll cover a little bit more about that later. But we can never assume similarity based on surface evidence. And that is one of the things that is so tricky, is that we can't make assumptions, and we need to constantly be open to being able to adapt our behavior based on the situation that we're in. And so by really thinking about our own cultures and what may have, you know, informed our cultures, every single one of us has a unique cultural background. And that will have been shaped by our upbringing and those early experiences that we have. And they will impact every interaction we have and what we consider to be the norm and our own comfort zone and environment. So what we're really wanting to build is mutual awareness and respect for these cultural differences. I'd like you to think for a moment about what defines your unique cultural identity. Think about your personal values and beliefs. What are those elements that you think have shaped who you are, that you can point back to your cultural or your background and upbringing? And what would be really beneficial for your colleagues to understand about you? One of the great things of this interaction last week with my husband and his colleague from Saudi Arabia was her willingness to then share what was normal in her country, which then allowed him to become more educated and understand how then she wanted to be responded to. So there's tremendous value in that self-awareness, and then that ability to be able to communicate to others what's going to work best and what is the most comfortable and normal way that you are wanting to relate. So let's go ahead and explore that question. What are the key elements of your cultural identity that would be really beneficial for others to understand? So we're going to do that again with a new mural link. So following that link. And this time we're going to be thinking about, what do you already know about yourself that would be really useful, particularly when you're working with colleagues from very different cultures, about your personal values, your beliefs, your communication styles, your work habits and preferences, and so on. Go ahead and just let us know there. And I see, Sabina, you have your hand raised. Did you have a question? I'm not sure if audio is actually activated for this. It might not be, in which case do go ahead and type your question into the chat. Just pop your question into the chat. I want to make sure that if you do have questions, that I can address them. So think about things that inform your working preferences, your attitudes to time. For me, I know when as a South African, when I first moved to the UK, something I became really aware of, that one of the features of a South African culture is quite direct communication. And I learned that people don't necessarily come out straight away with what they mean in some parts of the UK in particular. And that actually telling colleagues about that I am quite direct and not to be offended by that really, really helped break down some of the barriers, or prevented some of the perceived lack of respect or over assertiveness that may have been thoughts on my new colleagues' minds. So think about, for you, what might those be? So time optimist, I love that. Time optimist. Hate tardiness. I love that. I think many of us are time optimists. Another feature of some parts of cultures is a very different perception around time. How acceptable it is to be late or not. The value of trust for some of us. The concept of Ubuntu, I am because you are. That really, really important aspect around referencing and relating to the group versus the individual. A really important difference, really important feature. Being aware of and acknowledging others. Absolutely. Modesty, not bragging and self-deprecating. Definitely a feature of some cultures where it's not considered the norm to speak openly and confidently about your strengths, but to instead be much more modest about those. Openness, transparency, deadlines, commitment, empowerment, and accountability. And that can often show up with different leadership styles in working, respectful, humor, absolutely. And really thinking about how what we do that we consider really normal and how that might land with others who have a very different culture. One of the most valuable things about having this self-awareness is that ability to communicate to others how you operate, how you work, what they might experience from you, and therefore being able to influence how they might interpret that. A colleague I work with, when she's concentrating deeply, she has a real frown and a serious look on her face that many people interpret as unhappiness with something, or that she's disagreeing. And so when she meets people for the first time, she says things like, my resting face, I'm told, looks a bit angry, but actually it just means that I'm really, really interested. And that, I think, has saved her a lot of miscommunication and misinterpretation of her motives or intentions. So not taking things too seriously, that playfulness, that element of fun and playfulness. Proactive communication, we've mentioned directness as well. Don't speak unless there's something useful to say, not just for the sake of talking. Yeah. Work ethics, values. We see behaviors, work ethics, values, actions, all sorts of things coming through here, and mindset, which is really amazing. Amazing, amazing. So thank you for entering those. A really fantastic range of really clear examples around how this shows up. So as we continue on, I'm just going to head back and share my screen again and think about how we then take this self-awareness and what we actually are able to do with that and manage that. Let's have a quick look at how this awareness might show up in a team. So what we see here is an indication of just one of the elements of diversity and how that can impact on a team. And in particular, if we take one of the distinguishing characteristics around cognitive diversity, in other words, the way we process information and think differently. Now, often there's a really clear cultural difference in these ways of processing and thinking. And these can show up in teams in a number of different ways. So the first example here, the echo chamber in image 1, represents a team that's made up of people who all have really similar backgrounds. And that could be their education, their experiences, their cultural background, so geographically where they're from, their values. And what happens then is there is a significant overlap of perspective. So one of the ways that you might see this is very little disagreement, everybody absolutely thinking and coming up with the same solutions and the same points of view, which can feel very nice, and feel like you've got tremendous harmony in your team. But the real downside of this is what it produces is a collective perspective that represents a very small proportion, potentially, of the rest of the world. So imagine that you've got a team trying to solve a global problem, and they all think exactly the same, process the same, have the same ideas and the same values. Their ideas are going to have very limited applicability. So, for example, if you only hire people who speak English, trying to interact with customers who speak other languages is a challenge. And there's so much overlap, and the awareness in those teams of just how little else you might be seeing. So if you have a highly harmonious and homogeneous team, it can feel great and joyful to be in that. However, the downside and the risk that you might need to be aware of is, in what ways might we need to be thinking differently? The next element is what we call diverse. So this is where we have a team that is cognitively diverse. In other words, a wide spectrum of experiences and values and perspectives and ways of processing and backgrounds. And what then happens is the value that each perspective then brings increases because you have less overlap. So suddenly you collectively have access to a much wider pool of information from the universe of knowledge. The universe of knowledge has literally expanded because it includes the full range of each of these members' knowledge. So because there's a lot less overlap, each member adds something unique. And our ability to tap into the knowledge of others' perspective is then really increased, and we're able to start to really leverage the value to come up. So while it might be more challenging to come to an agreement, more challenging to collaborate because of the differences, the quality of the outcome significantly increases. In the third aspect here, what we see is inclusive teams. Because one of the big dangers about diversity is that we put all our energy into being truly diverse, but we don't focus enough on how to then tap into that incredible wisdom. So how do we make sure that we're able to leverage that diversity by having the skills to bring these perspectives together, that we don't stay in a place where we've got multiple fantastic different opinions and views, but we're not able to actually use them because we don't have a way to collaborate and come to conclusions and effectively communicate. Because when we have the right context and culture and mix of diversity, and the team can make the connection between each perspective to draw excellent, creative, and innovative solutions, we can truly fix real-world problems. And that's the real destination, is how do we develop these skills to truly leverage the diversity that is our real potential, our real opportunity. So thinking about this as we move on, building our cultural intelligence then is kind of a way of describing what do these skills actually mean and what are they doing. So let's do another quick chat entry. What does the term cultural intelligence mean to you? So go ahead and type into the chat, what does the term cultural intelligence, if our goal is to build cultural intelligence, what does it actually mean? Cultural intelligence. I think we've spoken a lot in recent years about emotional intelligence. We're now talking about cultural intelligence. Understanding someone else's perspective. Understanding and respecting differences. Really important. More than just understanding, also respecting. How to take the best of these inclusive teams. Deal effectively. Adaptation, being able to adapt ourselves, being the one to adapt, not waiting for the other person to adapt to us. Both understanding and then actually having a way of dealing with it is really important. Getting connection and making sure that people are not left out and we're able to tap into that and anticipate what some of the issues might be. So let's have a look at what cultural intelligence, what are the elements that make up cultural intelligence? Firstly, it's a very particular attitude. And a culturally intelligent attitude means that we are open to investigating our cultural influences, both our cultural influences as well as those of others. We're open to the differences, into changing our view of what is normal and how our cultures shape us. All of this gives us the power to control the subconscious influence of our culture, because every single one of us will have biases that we are unaware of, unconscious biases. That is just part of being human. But the more conscious we can make these, the more we're able to adapt our behavior to make sure that we are not disqualifying people because of that difference. So really having that attitude of curiosity and awareness. The second one is self-awareness, which you've heard me say a few times already, Because when we understand ourselves, we're much, much more able to work on the differences with others and notice how we might be impacting and affecting others. We're able to educate people about how they might be experiencing us. And what was really great about the situation that happened last week with my husband was the conversation that followed, whereby he went, "I'm so terribly sorry. I had no idea." And she was able to say, "That is absolutely fine." He then progressed on to say, "How would you like to be greeted? What is the norm in your culture for men and women greeting?" And she was actually able to explain to her that where she comes from, a man actually would then place his hand like this over his heart when greeting, to show a sign of respect. And immediately my husband was able to do that and repeat the greeting in a way that actually honored that cultural difference. So the courage to speak up and explain, the courage to ask what is okay, what is acceptable, and the courage to then follow through and actually try that out, and to notice her delighted response. And of course, now he has built his knowledge about that, because the more we know and the more we learn, that is not probably something he will do easily again. He will notice next time. He will be slightly waiting to see when he's traveling in Saudi Arabia, to not just assume. For example, so in his trip in a few weeks, he now knows that's he will be waiting. So learning about cultural preferences can help us so much. And the good news is that you can actually learn not just the do's and don'ts, because those are very good to know, but also the underlying values and attitudes. And World Prism, our tool at Country Navigator, is a great tool for this. And we'll have a look at this next to see how a tool like World Prism can really help understand these differences and then how they might show up in real life. The last element here is learning the skills, because as we said, understanding is just the first step. We can understand, but then what do we do with that understanding? How do we actually take that and take it out into the world and apply that to increase the quality of our interactions and communication and collaboration cross-culturally? So let's go before we jump into World Prism, let's take a look at a scenario. And I know there's a lot of text, so I'm going to read through this because we're going to see kind of a real life example of how these differences show up and what the potential impact is. So we have a colleague called Michael who's getting ready to start his weekly team meeting. Everyone's arrived and they've started settling in their seats, and he's checking the agenda when all of a sudden he receives a message from a client saying they have not received the proposal that he expected the previous week. Angry, because it's a very important client, he turns to Grace Kim, who was supposed to have sent the proposal. "Grace, I've just got an email from Nick asking me why he still hasn't received an offer. You should have sent it. Why didn't you? Have you forgotten?" The conversation in the room stops. Everyone is uncomfortable. Grace, with a horrified look in her eyes, begins to apologize. "Sorry, I'll do it right now." "No, it's fine. You can send it after the meeting, but it's important he receives it today." Shortly after the meeting, Grace walks into Michael's office to tell him that the offer has been sent. As the problem is solved, Michael thanks Grace and assures her that everything is fine now. After all, Grace had never made a mistake like this before. Grace nods and leaves the office. For the next few weeks, Grace takes a few sick days, and after 3 weeks, she quits her job. So my question for you is, what do you think happened that led to Grace quitting her job? What do you think some of those cultural differences, that underpin expectations around behavior. What has happened? And as we see, there's been a real consequence. Losing someone who is very good at her job, because it says she's never made a mistake, which few of us can say that. We've never made a mistake like this before. Yeah, really interesting. Humiliated in front of the team, public shaming, lost face in front of everyone. Egos coming out, attacked. No psychological safety, really important term. And degrading, loss of comfort. Didn't read the room, didn't understand the impact, not only on Grace, which of course was significant, but of course, the rest of the team, they're going to be left also with the impact of this. And no support from the manager. So you had a very kind of individual response. So really, really important. So let's spend a few moments now looking at the World Prism tool. And we're going to look at that through a video, which will introduce you to the World Prism tool if you have not yet been introduced to it. And then we'll revisit this and think about what might have been showing up. What might have been showing up?
Two fish are swimming through the ocean when they hit a different current. One turns to the other and says, "Brr, the water's a bit cold today." The other fish replies, "What's water?" One of the biggest challenges of culture is that, like a fish in water, we don't notice the very thing that has such a huge impact on everything we do and think and say. Country Navigator developed the World Prism model of culture to help reveal the invisible. It's a framework which will help you to examine culture and identify your own cultural preferences and the preferences of those around you. World Prism gives you an objective, scientific way to examine culture that can help you leverage cultural differences as a positive force. World Prism starts with cultural intelligence at the center. Cultural intelligence impacts on the three key areas of interpersonal interaction: relating, regulating, reasoning. Relating is how we work with others. Regulating is how we manage others. And reasoning, how we think and persuade others. These three R's underpin everything. We're going to take a whistle-stop tour of each of the three dimensions that make up the three R's. Firstly, the relating dimensions. Task or relationship deals with your fundamental approach to collaboration and where your priorities are. Is your priority the task, leaving the relationship to come, or do you prefer to build a relationship up before you start on the task? Those with an explicit approach can be characterized by the saying, "I mean what I say and I say what I mean." They take the primary meaning of the words said. They are direct and can use a lot of words to avoid doubt. Implicit communicators look for meaning in the context between and around the words said. They place a lot of emphasis on subtleties of meaning, power relationships, and body language. They may say less and appear to be quieter. Individual-oriented people rely on themselves. They identify themselves separately from those around them, are self-motivated, and collaborate in order to advance their own interests. They prefer to make decisions themselves and avoid dependence on others. Those with a group orientation thrive around others. They are aware of their own limits and expect others to cover their weaker areas. They look for consensus in decisions and expect to be informed around wider events and tasks. The three regulating dimensions start with a tight, loose scale, which relates to perception of time. A tight perception sees time as a commodity with value. The amount of time you give shows the value you assign. Deadlines are important, and wasting time and interruptions are not welcomed. A loose view of time sees time as flexible. You need to adapt to circumstances, and a deadline can only be a guide or an intention. Often the journey is as important as the destination. A shared culture is one that sees power as distributed according to talent and ability. A good leader knows their limitations and brings in experts to support their decision-making. The best hierarchies are flat, and formality can slow things down. At the other end of the scale, concentrated cultures have steep hierarchies, with power kept close. Leaders are more likely to have power from their connections and will closely guard information to maintain control. Status symbols and formalities are important. The final set of reasoning dimensions focuses on how we think about problems and present solutions. Those who take a linear approach prefer structured, logical approaches to finding solutions, examining each element in sequence to find improvements. The circular thinkers prefer to step back and think around the challenge, looking at it from different perspectives, taking their time to consider as many alternatives as possible. A facts-oriented thinker is an evidence gatherer, comfortable with data and interpretation. A thinking orientation is a sign of an approach that looks at models to find general points that can be applied to the specific situation. They are more likely to look for connections between data points and look for patterns. And finally, simple complex. A simple orientation has a preference for concise, high-level arguments that get to the point quickly. An image paints 1,000 words. Short introductions are preferred, followed by a summary argument and clear conclusion. Those with a complex orientation want the details. They want to be convinced that they understand how you came to your recommendation or conclusion and need to understand the background to it, even if that means spending a lot of time. The best way to understand World Prism is to take the self-assessment and start understanding your profile and recognizing others.
Thank you, Luke. And it is a fascinating dive into what really makes up our unique cultural profile. And the fascinating part of it is then to be able to see how our profile might then interact with profiles from different cultures and where those challenges might be, what will be easy and what will be difficult. So now that we've had a look at a little bit of a closer look at what we mean by World Prism and these three key areas and those elements that underpin them, let's take a moment to go back and have a look at the scenario that we just looked at and think about, what could have been done differently. Now, a number of you have already put some thoughts in terms of what could have been done differently. But now that we've seen the World Prism profile, I'm curious about whether you are able to identify any of the elements in there that might have been at play, any of the real differences, and pop them into the chat. So either examples of what could have been different or what cultural elements could have been at play. What could Michael have done differently? So what might have been, and even if you don't have the exact wording of the element, kind of describing what might have led to that. So if you had to imagine what Grace's cultural preferences might have been versus Michael's cultural preferences. So yeah, asking questions before reacting. So jumping straight into action and not actually investigating. Assessing the problem in private, doing it one-to-one. And the difference between what we would appear if we just took that one, let's think about one or two of those elements. So explicit communication. I mentioned that I know that's part of my cultural makeup of coming straight out and saying something directly versus much more reflective and nuanced and perhaps talking around something. We could see that Michael is probably really strongly on the end of that very direct communication. And interestingly, Grace has not come out and directly challenged Michael on his treatment of her. Instead, she's retreated and then left. So a very different approach to that conflict situation. So we can see that that coming out there as well. And very possibly also the individual orientation of Michael, which is really not seeing in that moment, not seeing the impact of this on his team. And purely thinking about his, as somebody pointed out, ego and individual objective, and not thinking, oh, actually, let me protect my team here. Let me protect my teammate. Let me think about it from the team perspective instead. Whereas Grace clearly has a very high team orientation in that she's probably imagining that she will never be able to regain the respect that she enjoyed with the team before she was scolded in front of her peers. So some great recommendations here. And again, that preference for longer preamble and intros, the relationship element before jumping straight into the task. Michael jumped straight into the task instead of leading into the meeting with finding out how people were. So really interesting. And yes, Carla, you're right. He should have known not to react this way. So let's keep thinking about what we are able to now do and what some of the different ways we can respond when we know that there are cultural differences, significant cultural differences. And I want to share with you a number of different strategies that you can use that really depend on the level of cultural intelligence, and the strategy being a conscious, deliberate decision to address cultural differences. One of the first things is to acknowledge that there are cultural differences and that they do have an impact, and to be aware of those differences instead of being oblivious and just operating. So when you have a highly diverse team, uncovering cultural differences and behaviors and values that exist in your team with the tool like World Prism is a really essential first step. So understanding what these differences are and then how they actually play out in the team. So let's look through some different options and then think about for your own teams which options you might be noticing or which ones might work best. So the first one is adapt. And this is the simplest and most frequent option. One person adjusts their style to the others. It's the simplest because it requires only one person to change, and because there's a clear goal to develop a style that is closer to their counterparts. In other words, in the example with my husband last week, he adapted. He immediately changed the way he did the introduction, and in that way, his objective was to make that connection and have a good conversation with this, and it was absolutely achieved by adapting. Uncovering differences and then adapting it to them, his style to theirs. In a complex team, it's a less effective strategy as the differences are more emphasized. So it works best in a one-to-one situation, because if everyone's adapting to everyone else, it's really difficult to know what the preference actually is. And so it works best with one-on-one where there's significant where there's a significant power differential. For example, adapting your style to suit that of a customer is a really important thing, or a stakeholder. It's really important that you take that initiative and responsibility of being the one to change. The next strategy in a complex team, again, a better approach might be blend. So this is a mix of your way and my way. And this is where the leader invites the team to agree collectively on the team culture. So each individual actively contributes to defining and creating the team culture. And for a new team, this is a great way of building engagement and ownership. Because although it takes time to agree and does need someone to facilitate, especially if there are some sensitive areas, there's the potential that the end result is going to be much more long-term. And coming up with ways that then are able to accommodate, taking the best of the best, for example. Co-create is where we develop a new way that works best for both of us. And this is a kind of refinement of the blend strategy where the leader invites the team to collectively agree the team culture and takes basically they create a new culture. So this differentiates itself from blend, where you're taking the best of the best to combine into an agreed culture. This might be creating something completely new that you haven't done before. A great example of this might be accommodating different time zones. Is what creative way might you come up with that you haven't done before? Whereas perhaps both parties are at a time that doesn't work, for example, occasionally, as a different way of dealing with that. Divide. You do it your way and we'll do it our way. This proposes that you ignore the cultural differences and let each individual work as they prefer according to their cultural style. So this can work for established or small teams that have very little interdependence on each other. So a group of account managers may not need to collaborate with each other very often. So their cultural differences are not a barrier. They're each working in their own regions and own locations, come together very seldom. The risk is where there's a team that needs to collaborate more closely. And this difference, if not accommodated, can lead to conflict and demoralizing certain people within that. And that issues may not be diagnosed and may just be sitting in the background. And finally, enforce. Sometimes the leader just needs to say, this is what we're doing. Now, this is effective where the culture is mission critical. For example, dangerous situations. So if a team is in a high hazard environment, it might be so crucial that there is a particular culture that gets adopted, or where the team is a very short-term grouping for a specific, very time-restrained purpose. The risk is if this becomes the norm and continues for too long, that can discourage people. Also, it really helps if you acknowledge that it is for a period of time and for a particular purpose, that you're going to go with this way or this time or this approach for the purposes of safety and so on, or compliance. So thinking about this, it's really useful to think about the next time you are cross-collaborating in a cross-cultural team, which of these is going to be the most effective for your team and for you to achieve your objectives. And as we consider that, I'm just going to spend a few moments summarizing what we've covered. And we've looked at the importance of self-awareness, and we've looked at the elements of cultural intelligence and the elements that often make culture so tricky, which is the above the surface and the below the surface with the hippo analogy. What I'd love you to do now is to think about and enter into the chat what has been your key takeaway from this session, what's resonated, what's had value, what's had meaning. And while I do that, I'm going to ask Luke, please, to pop into the chat a link, because you might like to explore World Prism, and you might like to email us and get access to a trial login where you can actually go and explore and in a trial account and explore your unique cultural profile and see where you sit on those different lines that we discussed. And if you do have a Country Navigator account, do click on the link and follow the learning path. And that is in the chat right now. So do go ahead and type in what's been useful, what's been valuable. And while you do that, I want to thank you so much for all your great energy and participation. I've loved your energy around the comments in particular, all your inputs and examples and questions. it all contributes to our collective learning, and just reminds us how important it is to keep learning. So thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to seeing you in future webinars. From my side, thank you and all the best.